The letter trembled in Victoria Calloway's hand as the stagecoach rattled over another bump in the dusty trail. April 1876 was proving to be a particularly unforgiving month in the Wyoming Territory. Sweat trickled down her back, dampening her corset and the layers of petticoats beneath her traveling dress. She glanced down at the address scrawled on the envelope for what must have been the 100th time since leaving Boston 3 weeks prior. Pine Creek Ranch, Sweetwater County, Wyoming Territory. It was all she had to go on. That, and the desperate plea from her cousin Eleanor, who had written that she needed Victoria's help running the boarding house she'd inherited. With nothing left for her in Boston after her parents' passing and the family fortune lost to her father's poor investments, Victoria had packed her meager belongings and headed west. Last stop before Sweetwater. The driver called out, his gruff voice barely audible over the thundering of hooves and creaking of the coach. Victoria peered out the window at the vast expanse of prairie dotted with sagebrush and the occasional pine tree. The mountains loomed in the distance, their snow-capped peaks a stark contrast to the golden-brown landscape below. Nothing like the crowded streets of Boston she'd known all her 22 years. When the stagecoach finally rolled to a stop in front of a small outpost, Victoria gathered her courage along with her carpetbag and parasol. The door swung open, and a weathered hand reached in to help her down. "Thank you," she murmured, stepping carefully onto the wooden platform. Her legs felt wobbly after hours of being jostled about. "You can wait inside the station," the driver said, already moving to unstrap her trunk. "Next coach to Sweetwater ain't due till tomorrow morning." Victoria's heart sank. Tomorrow. "But I was told this coach would take me all the way to Sweetwater," the driver shrugged. "Routes changed last month, miss. Nothing I can do about it." With a sigh, Victoria made her way into the station, a simple wooden structure with a few benches and a counter where a thin man with spectacles was sorting mail. "Excuse me, sir," she said, approaching the counter. "I need to get to Pine Creek Ranch in Sweetwater County." "Is there any way I might secure transportation today?" The clerk looked up, adjusting his spectacles. "Pine Creek, you say? That's a good 30 miles from here." "Yes, my cousin Eleanor owns a boarding house there. I'm to help her run it." The clerk's brow furrowed. "Boarding house at Pine Creek." "Don't recall any such establishment." A cold feeling crept up Victoria's spine. "Perhaps it's new." The letter was sent 3 months ago. Before the clerk could respond, the door swung open, bringing with it a gust of wind and dust and the imposing figure of a man. Victoria turned, taking in the tall stranger dressed in worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a dust-covered cowboy hat. "Afternoon, Jackson," the clerk called out. "Mail came in for you yesterday." The man Jackson nodded and strode to the counter. His spurs jingled with each step, and Victoria couldn't help but notice the revolver holstered at his hip. He smelled of horses and leather, and something indefinably wild. "Any word on those cattle prices from Cheyenne?" Jackson asked, his voice deep and rough, like he didn't use it often. "Nothing yet," the clerk replied, handing over a small bundle of letters. "This lady here's looking to get to Pine Creek Ranch, says her cousin has a boarding house there." Jackson's gaze shifted to Victoria, his eyes a startling shade of blue against his sun-bronzed skin. He studied her for a moment, taking in her city clothes and the exhaustion evident on her face. "There ain't no boarding house at Pine Creek," he said finally. "Just my ranch and a couple of homesteads scattered about." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. "But that can't be right." "I have a letter." She fumbled with her reticule, pulling out Eleanor's letter and thrusting it toward him. Jackson took it reluctantly, scanning the contents. His expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. "This Eleanor Calloway?" he asked, handing the letter back. "Yes, my cousin. Do you know her?" Jackson exchanged a glance with the clerk before answering. "Eleanor Calloway died of fever 6 weeks ago, madam. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you." Victoria's legs gave way beneath her, and she would have fallen had Jackson not caught her arm, guiding her to a nearby bench. Eleanor dead. It couldn't be. The room spun around her as the implications set in. She had no money to return east, no family left, and now no cousin to take her in. "What am I to do?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "Where were you headed exactly?" Jackson asked, crouching down to her level. Victoria handed him the envelope with the address. He examined it, a frown creasing his brow. "This says Pine Creek Ranch," he said slowly. "That's my place, but I never heard of any boarding house, and I certainly didn't know Alina had kin coming." "But the letter," Victoria began, confusion clouding her thoughts. Jackson Quinn, for that was his full name as the clerk had addressed him, rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "Alina worked for me as a housekeeper before she took ill. She lived in the cabin on my property. Maybe she had plans I didn't know about." Victoria tried to process this information through her grief and exhaustion. "So, I've been sent to the wrong address." A ghost of a smile touched Jackson's lips, softening his rugged features. "I reckon not, Miss Calloway. If Alina sent for you, then Pine Creek is exactly where you're meant to be." His words, simple as they were, provided a strange comfort. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, standing up and offering her his hand, "that I've been needing help since Alina passed. Ranch that size doesn't run itself, and I've been without a proper housekeeper for weeks. If you're willing to work, I've got room for you." Victoria stared at his outstretched hand, considering her options, which were, in truth, non-existent. With a deep breath, she placed her gloved hand in his calloused one and allowed him to help her to her feet. "I've never been a housekeeper before," she admitted. "I was raised to run a household with servants, not to be one." Jackson's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Everyone's got to start somewhere. I reckon you'll learn quick enough. And my accommodations. Alina's cabin is yours if you want it. It's simple but sound." Victoria thought of the elegant townhouse in Boston where she'd grown up, with its polished floors and fine furnishings. She thought of the life she'd expected to lead as the wife of some respectable businessman. None of that was possible now. "Very well, Mr. Quinn," she said with as much dignity as she could muster. "I accept your offer." Jackson nodded once as if the matter were settled. "Got my wagon outside. We can head out now if you're ready." Within half an hour, Victoria found herself perched on the wooden seat of a farm wagon, her trunk secured in the back, heading away from the outpost into the vast wilderness of Wyoming. Jackson drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, occasionally flicking to the darkening sky. "Storm coming," he commented as the wind picked up, bringing with it the scent of rain. Victoria clutched her bonnet to keep it from flying away. "Will we reach the ranch before it hits?" "Should. It's about 2 hours' ride." 2 hours stretched into a companionable silence, broken only by Jackson's occasional comments about landmarks or wildlife. Victoria found herself studying him surreptitiously. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way of Boston gentlemen, but there was something compelling about his strong profile and the quiet confidence with which he handled the horses. When the first drops of rain began to fall, Jackson urged the horses to a faster pace. The ranch house came into view just as the sky opened up in earnest, a sturdy 2-story structure built of logs with a wide porch and several outbuildings scattered around it. "Home," Jackson said simply, pulling the wagon up to the front of the house. Before Victoria could respond, he jumped down and came around to help her. His hands were strong and sure as he lifted her from the seat, setting her gently on the ground. For a brief moment, they stood close enough that she could see the rain droplets clinging to his eyelashes. "Let's get you inside," he said, breaking the moment. "I'll bring your things." The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly spacious, with a large main room dominated by a stone fireplace. Simple but sturdy furniture filled the space: a dining table with chairs, a couple of armchairs, and shelves lined with books and various household items. "Kitchen's through there," Jackson said, pointing to a doorway. "Bedroom's upstairs. Alina's cabin is out back, but you'll stay here tonight until the storm passes." Victoria nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the events of the day and the realization that this was now her home, this strange place with this taciturn man. "I'll show you where you can freshen up," Jackson said, seemingly sensing her distress. He led her to a small room off the kitchen where a basin and pitcher sat on a washstand. "I'll get a fire going and see about some supper." Left alone, Victoria removed her bonnet and gloves, splashing water on her face and doing her best to smooth her travel-rumpled dress. In the small mirror hanging above the washstand, Her reflection showed a pale face with tired green eyes and honey-brown hair escaping from its pins. "What have I gotten myself into?" she whispered to her reflection. When she emerged, Jackson had a fire crackling in the hearth and was stirring something in a pot that hung from a hook in the fireplace. "It's just beans and bacon," he said apologetically. "Haven't had much time for proper cooking lately." "It smells wonderful," Victoria said truthfully, her stomach reminding her that she hadn't eaten since morning. They ate at the table, the silence punctuated by the sound of rain on the roof and the occasional roll of thunder. Victoria found herself stealing glances at Jackson, trying to reconcile the intimidating figure she'd first seen with the man who now sat across from her, offering her a home when she had nowhere else to go. "Tell me about Alina," she said finally. "We weren't close. She was much older than me, but she was my only remaining family." Jackson set down his fork, his expression softening. "She was a good woman, hardworking, kind. She came out here about 5 years ago after her husband died, needed work, and I needed help with the house. She kept to herself mostly, but she was fair and honest." "I didn't know she'd remarried," Victoria admitted. "Our families lost touch when she moved west." "Life out here changes people," Jackson said. "Makes them stronger or breaks them. Alina was one of the strong ones." Victoria wondered which she would be. The thought of breaking down in tears was tempting, but something in Jackson's steady gaze made her want to be one of the strong ones too. "I'll do my best to be a good housekeeper," she promised, "though I may need some patience as I learn." A ghost of a smile touched Jackson's lips. "I reckon we'll manage. Ranch hands are coming back tomorrow, been out with the herd. They'll be glad to have someone cooking proper meals again." "Ranch hands, how many?" "4 regulars plus a couple of seasonal workers. Don't worry, they're good men." "Respectful?" Victoria nodded, though the thought of cooking for 6 or more hard-working cowboys was daunting. In Boston, she'd supervised the cook, not been one. After supper, Jackson showed her to a bedroom upstairs. It was simply furnished with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a lamp. "It was Alina's room when she first came," he explained. "Before she moved to the cabin, there are some of her things in the drawers that might fit you until you can unpack your own." "Thank you, Mr. Quinn," Victoria said, touched by his thoughtfulness. "For everything." Jackson nodded, his hand resting on the doorframe. "Jackson," he corrected. "Mr. Quinn was my father." "Jackson," she repeated softly. "Then you must call me Victoria." Something shifted in his expression, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Victoria," he said, as if testing the name. "Sleep well. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure out the rest." With that, he left her alone, closing the door behind him. Victoria sat on the edge of the bed, listening to his footsteps retreat down the hallway. Only then did she allow the tears to come, quiet sobs for Alina, for her parents, for the life she'd left behind, and for the uncertain future that lay ahead. Outside, the storm raged on, but eventually, exhaustion won out over anxiety, and Victoria drifted off to sleep to the sound of rain on the roof and the occasional creak of the sturdy log house. Morning brought clear skies and the realization that her new life had truly begun. Victoria dressed in one of Alina's simple cotton dresses, which was a bit loose but serviceable, and made her way downstairs. The house was quiet, but the front door stood open, letting in the fresh, rain-washed air. She found Jackson on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the sunrise paint the distant mountains gold. "Good morning," she said, stepping out to join him. He turned, and for a moment he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded toward the breathtaking view. "Worth waking up for," Victoria had to agree. The vast landscape stretched before them, the prairie still wet with dew, wildflowers dotting the grass with splashes of color. In the distance, a herd of what looked like elk grazed peacefully. "It's beautiful," she admitted. "Different from anything I've ever known, but beautiful." Jackson handed her his cup of coffee, made a fresh pot in the kitchen, "Thought you might need it." The gesture, small as it was, touched her. "Thank you." They stood in companionable silence for a few minutes, sharing the coffee and the sunrise. Then Jackson set the empty cup on the porch rail. "Ranch hands will be back around noon," he said. "I need to check the north pasture fence that came down in the storm." "Think you can manage breakfast on your own?" Victoria straightened her shoulders. I believe I can handle eggs and bacon, at least. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Pantry's stocked. Eleanor kept a cookbook on the shelf above the stove if you need it. With that, he stepped off the porch and headed for the barn. Victoria watched him go, noticing the way he moved confident, purposeful, at home in this wild landscape. The kitchen proved to be a challenge, but not an insurmountable one. She found the eggs, bacon, and coffee easily enough, and Eleanor's cookbook was indeed a godsend. By the time Jackson returned, she had managed a respectable breakfast of fried eggs, bacon, and biscuits that were only slightly overdone. "Not bad for your first try," Jackson said, helping himself to a second biscuit. "The biscuits are hard as rocks," Victoria said with a sigh. "Been eating my own cooking for weeks," he reminded her. "These are a vast improvement." After breakfast, Jackson showed her around the property: the chicken coop, the vegetable garden that needed tending, the springhouse where milk and butter were kept cool, and finally, Eleanor's cabin. It was a simple one-room structure with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a small trunk at the foot of the bed. Someone Jackson, she presumed, had cleaned it recently, as there was no dust on the surfaces. "It's not much," he said, watching her reaction carefully. "It's perfect," Victoria replied, and meant it. The cabin was small but solid, with a window that looked out over a small stream. It was private, peaceful, and hers. "Eleanor's things are still here," Jackson continued. "Take what you can use. The rest we can store or give away, whatever you prefer." Victoria ran her hand over the worn quilt on the bed, imagining her cousin sitting here, perhaps reading by lamplight or writing the letter that had brought Victoria west. "I'd like to keep some of her things," she decided. "To remember her by." Jackson nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take your time settling in. I'll be around if you need anything." True to his word, the ranch hands returned around noon, 4 men of varying ages, all sun-weathered and trail-dusty, but polite in their rough way when Jackson introduced them to Victoria. There was Vernon, the oldest at around 50, who served as foreman, Hank and Bill, brothers in their 30s who had been with the ranch for years, and Tobias, the youngest at perhaps 20, who worked as a general hand and had a talent with horses. "Miss Calloway's taking over as housekeeper," Jackson explained. "Eleanor was her cousin." The men offered their condolences for Eleanor's passing and their appreciation for Victoria's willingness to step into her cousin's role. "Eleanor made the best apple pie west of the Mississippi," Hank said wistfully. "I'll do my best to live up to her reputation," Victoria promised, though she'd never made a pie in her life. The next few weeks passed in a blur of learning and adaptation. Victoria's hands, once soft and uncalloused, grew red and chapped from washing clothes and scrubbing floors. Her fair skin tanned under the Wyoming sun as she tended the vegetable garden and hung laundry on the line. She burned countless biscuits, overcooked stew, and once nearly set the kitchen on fire, but gradually she improved. Jackson was patient with her mistakes, offering quiet encouragement and sometimes practical help. He showed her how to milk the 2 cows, explained the best way to collect eggs without upsetting the hens, and even demonstrated how to make a decent cup of coffee, something she'd never had to do in Boston, where servants had handled such tasks. She learned about ranch life to the rhythm of days dictated by sunlight rather than clocks, the seasonal tasks of branding calves in spring and preparing for winter as summer waned. She discovered that Jackson Quinn was respected throughout the county as a fair employer and an honest businessman, and that Pine Creek Ranch was one of the most prosperous in the territory. What she didn't learn, however, was much about Jackson himself. He remained private, revealing little about his past or personal thoughts. He was unfailingly kind to her, but maintained a certain distance that Victoria found both frustrating and intriguing. One evening in late May, about a month after her arrival, Victoria was sitting on the porch of her cabin, enjoying the cool evening air after a particularly hot day. She'd just finished mending one of Jackson's shirts and was taking a moment for herself before preparing for the next day's work. The sound of footsteps made her look up to see Jackson approaching, his hat in his hand. In the fading light, With his dark hair slightly too long and his face shadowed with stubble, he looked almost like a figure from a novel, The Mysterious Rancher with Secrets in His Past. "Evening," he said, stopping at the edge of her small porch. "Mind if I join you?" "Please do," she replied, indicating the second chair. He sat, stretching his long legs out in front of him. "Wanted to check how you're settling in." "Well enough," Victoria said. "Though I still have much to learn." "You're doing fine," Jackson assured her. "Men are eating better than they have in months," Victoria laughed. "A low bar, considering what you told me about your cooking." A smile creased his face, transforming his normally serious expression. "Fair point." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I've been meaning to ask," Victoria said finally. "How did you come to own Pine Creek Ranch? It seems a substantial property for someone so young," he supplied when she hesitated. "I was going to say solitary," she admitted, Jackson's expression sobered. "It was my uncle's place, James Quinn. He had no children, so when he died 5 years ago, it came to me. I'd been working ranches since I was 16, learning the trade. Uncle James taught me the business side of things before he passed. And your parents," a shadow crossed his face, "dead. Cholera took them when I was 12, my sister too." "I'm sorry," Victoria said softly, understanding all too well the pain of losing family. Jackson shrugged, though the gesture seemed forced. "It was a long time ago. Some losses stay with us, no matter how much time passes," Victoria observed, thinking of her own parents. He glanced at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing past the surface for the first time. "Yes, they do." The moment stretched between them, a connection formed through shared grief. Then Jackson cleared his throat and stood up. "Nearly forgot why I came by. Heading into town tomorrow for supplies. Thought you might want to come along, pick out some fabric for new dresses. Eleanor's things can't be comfortable, being too big for you." Victoria was touched by his thoughtfulness. "I would like that very much, thank you," he nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "We'll leave after breakfast. Good night, Victoria." "Good night, Jackson." She watched him walk away, back toward the main house, and felt something stir within her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the mild spring evening and everything to do with the way he'd said her name. The town of Sweetwater turned out to be little more than a wide spot in the road, a general store, a saloon, a small church, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of other businesses lining the single dusty street. Still, after weeks at the ranch, it seemed positively bustling to Victoria. Jackson's wagon drew curious glances as they pulled up in front of the general store. It wasn't until they were inside, with Jackson introducing her to the proprietor, Mr. Miller, that Victoria realized why. "So you're the city girl that's taken over for poor Eleanor," Mr. Miller said, pumping her hand enthusiastically. "Word gets around, you know. Folks have been wondering when Jackson here would bring you to town." Victoria glanced at Jackson, who seemed uncomfortable with the attention. "I've been quite busy learning my new duties," she explained diplomatically. Of course," Mr. Miller agreed. "Now, what can I help you with today?" While Jackson went through his list of ranch supplies, Victoria explored the fabric section. She selected several lengths of practical cotton in various patterns, as well as thread, buttons, and other notions she would need to make herself some proper work dresses. "You sew?" Jackson asked when he saw her selections. "One of the few useful skills I learned in Boston," Victoria admitted. "Though I'm more accustomed to embroidery than practical garments. There's a seamstress in town if you prefer," he offered. Victoria shook her head. "I'm capable enough. Besides, it will give me something to do in the evenings." Jackson nodded approvingly. "Practical, I like that." The simple compliment warmed her more than it should have. As they were loading their purchases into the wagon, a well-dressed woman approached, her expression openly curious. "Jackson Quinn, aren't you going to introduce me to your new housekeeper?" she asked, her tone friendly but her eyes assessing Victoria from bonnet to boots. "Victoria Calloway, this is Mrs. Rebecca Thornton, the mayor's wife," Jackson said, his tone polite but reserved. "Mrs. Thornton, Miss Calloway." Victoria offered her hand. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Thornton." "Likewise, my dear, we were so sorry to hear about your cousin. Eleanor was well liked in Sweetwater." "Thank you," Victoria said. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to continue her work at Pine Creek Ranch." Mrs. Thornton's gaze shifted between Victoria and Jackson, a speculative gleam in her eye. "You must join us for Sunday dinner sometime soon, both of you. The mayor would love to meet you, Miss Calloway." Before either could respond, Mrs. Thornton spotted someone else across the street and excused herself with a promise to send a formal invitation soon. "Do you often dine with the mayor?" Victoria asked as they climbed back into the wagon. Jackson's expression was pained. "Not if I can help it. Mrs. Thornton has been trying to marry me off to every eligible woman in the county since my uncle died." "Oh," Victoria said, oddly disappointed. "And are there many eligible women, I mean?" Jackson flicked the reins, starting the horses moving. "Not many. Most women with sense stay east, where there are proper towns and society." "Yet here I am," Victoria mused. Jackson glanced at her, the hint of a smile playing around his mouth. "Here you are, though I'm still not convinced you have sense, coming all this way on the strength of a letter." Victoria laughed. "Perhaps not, but I'm beginning to think it was the right decision nonetheless." The look he gave her then was impossible to interpret, but it made her heart beat a little faster. On the way back to the ranch, they stopped by a small creek for the horses to drink, and to eat the lunch Victoria had packed: cold chicken, biscuits, and apple tarts she'd managed to make successfully after 3 failed attempts. "These are good," Jackson said, taking a second tart. "Almost as good as Aliner's." "High praise indeed," Victoria replied with a smile, "though I still have much to learn about cooking over a wood stove. In Boston, I never even entered the kitchen except to give instructions to the cook." Jackson leaned back against a tree trunk, studying her. "You never talk much about your life there. What brought you west, really?" "Besides Aliner's letter," Victoria sighed, picking at a blade of grass. "There was nothing left for me in Boston. My father lost everything in bad investments before he died. The house, the business, even my mother's jewelry had to be sold to pay the debts. I was staying with a distant cousin who made it clear I was a burden. So you came west to start over." "Yes," she admitted, "though I had no idea what I was getting into." "Do you regret it?" Jackson asked, his eyes intent on her face. Victoria considered the question seriously. She thought of the hard work, the isolation, the primitive conditions compared to what she'd known in Boston. But she also thought of the breathtaking landscape, the satisfaction of mastering new skills, and the quiet evenings on her porch watching the sunset. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it at all." Something in Jackson's expression softened. "Good." "Because he stopped abruptly, looking away. "You what?" Victoria prompted gently. He shook his head. "Nothing important. We should head back. Clouds are building to the west." Victoria followed his gaze to see dark thunderheads gathering on the horizon. The moment, whatever it had been, was gone. Summer brought longer days and more work as the garden flourished and needed constant attention. Victoria settled into a routine, rising before dawn to start breakfast for the ranch hands, spending the mornings on household tasks, and the afternoons tending the garden or preserving its bounty for the winter months ahead. The cabin became truly hers as she added small touches: wildflowers in a jar on the table, a colorful quilt she'd pieced together from scraps, curtains she'd sewn for the window. In the evenings, she worked on her new dresses or read from the small collection of books Jackson had lent her. Jackson himself remained something of a mystery. Some days he was open and almost friendly, joining her on the porch after supper to talk about the day's work or sharing stories about the early years of the ranch. Other days he was distant, disappearing for hours on end to ride the boundaries of his property or work with the cattle, speaking only when necessary. Victoria found herself thinking about him more often than she should, wondering about the man behind the reserved exterior. She noticed small things: the gentleness in his hands when he worked with the horses, the way he always made sure she had enough firewood for her cabin, how he remembered that she preferred honey in her tea rather than sugar. One particularly hot afternoon in July, Victoria was at the creek that ran behind her cabin, washing clothes. She'd hitched up her skirts and waded in ankle-deep, enjoying the cool water on her bare feet as she scrubbed at a particularly stubborn stain on one of the kitchen towels. So absorbed was she in her task that she didn't hear the approach of hoofbeats until a shadow fell across the water. Looking up, she found Jackson on horseback, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Oh," she exclaimed, suddenly conscious of her exposed ankles and disheveled appearance. "I didn't hear you. Didn't mean to startle you," he said, dismounting. "Saw the washing and thought you might need help carrying it back." Victoria pushed a loose strand of hair from her face, aware that she must look a fright with her sleeves rolled up and perspiration dampening her bodice. "That's very kind of you," she said, stepping out of the creek and quickly pulling her skirts down. "I'm nearly finished." Jackson nodded, leading his horse to drink from the creek while Victoria wrung out the last few items and added them to the basket. When she tried to lift it, he stepped forward. "Let me," he said, taking the heavy basket from her hands. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, a fleeting touch that nevertheless sent a jolt of awareness through Victoria. She quickly looked away, busying herself with gathering her shoes and stockings. "Thank you," she murmured. They walked back to the cabin in silence, the only sounds the chirping of birds and the occasional snort from Jackson's horse, which followed behind them like an obedient dog. At the clothesline strung between two trees near the cabin, Jackson set down the basket and began handing her items to hang. It was domestic and strangely intimate, working together in the dappled shade. "Vernon mentioned you were asking about preserving fruit," Jackson said after a while. "Yes," Victoria confirmed, pinning up one of his shirts. "The berries are ripening, and I want to make jam before they're gone." "Eleanor used to put up enough to last the winter," Jackson recalled. "She'd make blackberry cobbler for Christmas dinner." There was something in his voice, a note of wistfulness, perhaps, that made Victoria look at him more closely. "You miss her," Jackson nodded, handing her another garment. "She was like family, only family I had left, really." "I understand," Victoria said softly. "When my parents died, it felt like the world had suddenly grown emptier, colder." "Exactly that," Jackson agreed, meeting her eyes, "though it's been less empty since you came." The admission hung between them, simple yet profound. Victoria felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't look away. "I'm glad," she said truthfully. For a moment, it seemed as if Jackson might say more, might even reach for her. Then his horse nickered, breaking the spell, and he stepped back. "I should get back to work," he said. "Fence in the south pasture needs fixing." Victoria nodded, disappointed yet unsure why. "Of course, thank you for your help." He tipped his hat to her and mounted his horse, but paused before riding away. "Victoria?" "Yes. Would you like to learn to ride? Properly, I mean, not just in a wagon." "It would make getting around the ranch easier for you." The offer surprised her. "I'd like that very much." A smile touched his lips. "Good. We'll start tomorrow if you're agreeable." With that, he rode away, leaving Victoria to wonder at the strange fluttering in her chest and the way his smile seemed to linger in her mind long after he'd gone. The riding lessons began the next day after breakfast. Jackson brought a gentle mare named Daisy to the corral near the barn, already saddled with what he explained was a side saddle. "It was Eleanor's," he said. "She didn't ride much, but she kept it for when she needed to." Victoria approached the horse cautiously. She'd ridden in Boston, of course, but only in the park on perfectly behaved mounts with a groom leading the way. This was different. "She won't bite," Jackson assured her, patting the mare's neck. "Daisy's the gentlest horse on the ranch." With his help, Victoria managed to mount, arranging her skirts modestly over the side saddle. Jackson adjusted the stirrup length and showed her how to hold the reins properly. "Keep your back straight but not stiff," he instructed, his hand at the small of her back guiding her into the correct posture. That's it. For the next hour, he led Daisy around the corral, teaching Victoria the basics of controlling the horse with gentle pressure from the reins and her legs. His patience was remarkable, his instructions clear and encouraging. "You're a natural," he said when she successfully guided Daisy through a figure-8 pattern. Victoria laughed, flushed with accomplishment. "Hardly, but I'm enjoying it more than I expected." "We'll try a short trail ride tomorrow," Jackson decided. "Just around the ranch so you can get used to different terrain." The daily riding lessons quickly became Victoria's favorite part of the day. Jackson was a skilled teacher. and she found herself looking forward to their time together perhaps more than was wise. It wasn't just the riding she enjoyed, but the conversations they had as they explored the ranch together. Away from the main house and the ranch hands, Jackson seemed to relax, sharing stories of his youth and his dreams for the ranch's future. She learned that he'd spent 2 years at a university in Denver before returning to ranch work, that he had a fondness for Shakespeare and could quote entire passages from memory, and that he secretly loved the wild beauty of Wyoming winters despite their harshness. In turn, she told him about growing up in Boston, about her love of music and art, and her childhood dreams of travel and adventure that had seemed impossible for a proper young lady. "And now here you are," Jackson said one afternoon as they paused their horses atop a ridge overlooking the entire ranch. "Having your adventure after all." Victoria smiled, taking in the breathtaking view. Pine Creek Ranch spread below them, the main house and outbuildings looking like toys from this distance, the creek that gave the ranch its name winding like a silver ribbon through the valley. "It's not the adventure I imagined," she admitted, "but I wouldn't trade it." Jackson studied her face for a long moment. "No regrets, then, about coming west?" "None," she said truthfully. "Though I do miss certain amenities, hot baths, for instance." Jackson laughed, a rare full sound that transformed his usually serious face. "That can be arranged, you know. We're not complete savages out here." "Oh," Victoria raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "There's a natural hot spring about an hour's ride from here. The water's clear and hot year-round. Indians used to consider it sacred ground." "It sounds wonderful," Victoria sighed, imagining the luxury of soaking in hot water after months of makeshift baths in her cabin. "I could take you there sometime," Jackson offered, "when the work slows down." The thought of visiting a secluded hot spring with Jackson sent a blush creeping up Victoria's neck, but she nodded. "I'd like that." As July turned to August, Victoria found herself increasingly aware of Jackson in ways that went beyond employer and employee, beyond even friendship. She noticed the way the sun had lightened streaks in his dark hair, how his blue eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the strength in his hands as he worked with the horses. More than once, she caught him watching her too when she was hanging laundry, or picking vegetables in the garden, or singing softly to herself as she kneaded bread dough. There was something in his gaze that made her heart race and her skin warm, something that spoke of interest beyond mere approval of her work. But Jackson maintained a careful distance, never crossing the invisible line between them. Victoria told herself it was for the best. She was his housekeeper, dependent on him for her livelihood and shelter. Any deeper attachment would be complicated, perhaps even foolish. Still, in the quiet of her cabin at night, she allowed herself to wonder what it might be like if circumstances were different, if she were a proper lady calling on the prosperous rancher, or if he were a gentleman courting her in Boston parlors. These daydreams were interrupted one sweltering afternoon in late August when a rider approached the ranch at a gallop. Victoria was on the porch shelling peas when she heard the hoofbeats and looked up to see a man she didn't recognize dismount in a cloud of dust. "Is Quinn here?" He called out, spotting her. "Mr. Quinn is checking the north pasture," Victoria replied, setting aside her work and approaching the stranger. "I expect him back soon." "Can I help you?" The man, middle-aged and trail-worn, shook his head. "Name's Donovan, from the Circle D ranch west of here. We've got rustlers hitting the herds, 3 ranches hit in the last week. Quinn needs to know." Victoria's stomach clenched with worry. "Please, come inside. You look like you could use water and something to eat." While the rider refreshed himself, Victoria sent Tobias, who had been repairing a fence nearby, to find Jackson. By the time Jackson returned, 2 more riders had arrived with similar news. "They're working their way east through the valley," one of the men explained as they gathered around the kitchen table. "Taking 10, 20 head at a time, small enough not to notice right away but adds up quick." Jackson's expression was grim. "Any idea who's behind it?" "Word is it's the Carson gang," Donovan said. "They've been operating out of the territories for years, usually hit farther north, but they must have found easier pickings down here." Victoria, serving coffee to the men, felt a chill despite the summer heat. She'd heard stories of the lawlessness in parts of the West, but Pine Creek had seemed untouched by such dangers. "We're forming a posse," one of the other ranchers said. "Riding out tomorrow to track them. You in, Quinn?" Jackson's eyes met Victoria's briefly before he nodded. "I'll ride with you." "My foreman Vernon too, if he's willing." After the men left, Jackson found Victoria in the garden where she'd gone to escape the tension in the house. She was pulling weeds with unnecessary vigor, her mind racing with worry. "Victoria," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. She looked up, shielding her eyes against the sun. "How dangerous is this, Jackson?" "Truly," he crouched down beside her, his expression serious. "I won't lie to you. These men are desperate and armed, but we'll have numbers on our side and the law. The sheriff is riding with you." "Deputy," Jackson corrected. "Sheriff's away in Cheyenne." Victoria pulled another weed, focusing on the task to hide her fear. "How long will you be gone?" "Hard to say. A few days, maybe a week." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The thought of Jackson facing armed rustlers filled her with dread, but she understood his responsibility to protect the ranch and its livestock. "Vernon will stay behind with Tobias," Jackson continued. "They'll keep an eye on things here, on you." "I'll be fine," Victoria assured him, though her voice lacked conviction. Jackson reached out then, his calloused fingers gently lifting her chin so she had to meet his eyes. "I'll come back, Victoria, I promise." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "You'd better," she managed to say. "I've just mastered your recipe for sourdough bread." A smile tugged at his lips. "Can't miss that." They stayed like that for a moment longer than necessary, his hand warm against her skin, something unspoken passing between them. Then Jackson stood, offering her his hand to help her up. "I'll be leaving at first light," he said. "Would you mind putting together some provisions, enough for several days on the trail?" "Of course," Victoria agreed, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I'll make sure you're well supplied." That evening, Victoria threw herself into preparations, baking journey bread that would keep without spoiling, cooking strips of bacon, packing coffee and other essentials. All the while, a knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. Jackson spent most of the evening in the barn, checking weapons and preparing his gear. When he finally came to the house, Victoria had a hot meal waiting and his trail provisions packed. "Thank you," he said, taking in the neatly wrapped packages. "This is more than I expected." "I want to make sure you're properly equipped," Victoria said, busy at the stove to hide her worry. "The weather can change quickly this time of year." Jackson ate in thoughtful silence while Victoria moved around the kitchen, unable to sit still. When he finished, he pushed back from the table. "I should get some rest," he said. "Long day tomorrow." Victoria nodded, her back to him as she unnecessarily wiped an already clean counter. "Of course. Good night then." She heard his chair scrape as he stood, expected to hear his footsteps retreating toward the stairs. Instead, she felt his presence directly behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Victoria," he said, his voice low. She turned slowly, finding herself mere inches from him. Yes, in the lamplight, his eyes were dark and serious. "I need to tell you something." In case he stopped, shook his head slightly. "Just in case." Victoria's heart hammered in her chest. "What is it?" "When you first came here," Jackson began, "I thought you wouldn't last a week. City girl like you, used to comforts and society. I figured you'd be on the next stage back east as soon as you realized what ranch life was really like." "Yet here I still am," Victoria said softly. "Here you are," he agreed. "And every day I find myself grateful for that letter that brought you to my door. Even if it was sent to the wrong address." Victoria's breath caught. "Jackson, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not good with words, not like this, but I need you to know that these past months, watching you adapt to this life, seeing your strength and determination, it's changed something in me, changed how I see the future of this place." "How do you see it?" Victoria whispered. Jackson's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch feather light. "I see you in it, not just as my housekeeper." The implication of his words sent a flutter through Victoria's stomach. "What are you saying, Jackson?" "I'm saying that when I come back," he murmured, leaning closer, "we need to talk about what happens next, for both of us." Before Victoria could respond, he closed the distance between them and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it might have been a dream. It lasted only a moment before he pulled away, his eyes searching hers. "Come back safely," Victoria whispered, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "Please," Jackson nodded, his thumb brushing her cheek once more before he stepped back. "I will, I promise." With that, he turned and left the kitchen, his footsteps receding up the stairs, leaving Victoria standing by the stove with her fingers pressed to her lips, and her heart full of both hope and fear for what the coming days might bring. The posse rode out at dawn, a group of 15 men including Jackson, Hank, Bill, and the deputy sheriff. Victoria was up before sunrise, preparing a hearty breakfast for the riders and packing the last of the provisions. As the men mounted up, Jackson sought her out, pulling her aside for a moment of privacy. "Remember what I said," he told her, his voice low. "Keep the rifle by your bed. Vernon and Tobias will check on you morning and evening." Victoria nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "I'll be fine. It's you I'm worried about." Jackson's expression softened. "I've faced worse odds." "That's not as reassuring as you might think," Victoria replied with a weak smile. He chuckled, then grew serious again. "I meant what I said last night, Victoria, all of it." "I know," she said simply. "Come back to me and we'll talk about that future you mentioned." With a final nod, Jackson rejoined the others. Victoria watched them ride away, the morning sun glinting off rifles and saddles, until they were just a dust cloud on the horizon. The first day of Jackson's absence passed slowly. Victoria threw herself into her usual tasks, cleaning the main house from top to bottom, and baking enough bread to last a week. Vernon and Tobias checked on her as promised, bringing news that all seemed quiet on the ranch. The second day was much the same, though Victoria found herself starting at every unusual sound, her nerves increasingly on edge. That night, a thunderstorm rolled in, bringing with it howling wind and driving rain that rattled the windows of her small cabin. Unable to sleep, Victoria sat by the fire with Jackson's rifle across her lap, listening to the storm and trying not to imagine Jackson and the others caught out in it, or worse, facing down dangerous men in such conditions. By the fourth day, her worry had evolved into a constant, gnawing anxiety. No word had come from the posse, which Vernon assured her was normal. They could be tracking the rustlers far from any settlement where they might send a message. "No news is good news, miss," he told her. "If anything had happened to them, we'd have heard by now." Victoria nodded, clinging to this reassurance even as doubt crept in. She went about her duties mechanically, her mind constantly wandering to Jackson, his smile, the feel of his lips on hers, the promise in his eyes when he'd spoken of their future. On the fifth evening, Victoria was in the main house preparing supper for Vernon and Tobias when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her heart leaped, and she rushed to the window, hoping to see Jackson returning victorious. Instead, she saw a single rider she didn't recognize, slouched in the saddle as if injured or exhausted. Vernon was already hurrying from the barn to meet him. Victoria wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, straining to hear the conversation between Vernon and the stranger. The rider dismounted stiffly, and in the fading light she could see he was favoring his left arm, which appeared to be bandaged. When Vernon turned toward the house, his expression was grim. Victoria's stomach dropped. "What is it?" she called out, unable to wait for him to reach her. "Is it Jackson? Is he hurt?" Vernon removed his hat as he approached, a gesture that sent ice through Victoria's veins. "The posse caught up with the rustlers yesterday morning, miss. There was a fight." "Jackson," Victoria repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Tell me." "He was shot," Vernon said bluntly. "Took a bullet in the shoulder. He's alive," he added quickly as Victoria swayed on her feet. "They got him to a doctor in Sweetwater. This fellow rode out to let us know." Relief washed over Victoria, followed immediately by renewed worry. "How bad is it?" "Will he recover? Doc says he'll live, but he's lost a lot of blood and the bullet was deep. He'll need time to heal." Victoria was already turning back to the house. "I need to go to him. Can you hitch the wagon?" Vernon shifted uncomfortably. Miss Calloway, it ain't proper for you to, I don't care what's proper, Victoria interrupted, a steel in her voice that surprised even her. Jackson is injured and I'm going to him. Either help me with the wagon or I'll saddle Daisy myself. Recognizing the determination in her eyes, Vernon nodded. I'll get the wagon ready, but I'm driving you there myself. The journey to Sweetwater seemed interminable, though in reality it took only a few hours. By the time they arrived, it was well past midnight, the town dark except for a few lamps burning in windows. The doctor's house was easy to find, a neat white building with a sign out front and a lamp still lit in the downstairs window. Victoria barely waited for the wagon to stop before jumping down and hurrying to the door. Her knock was answered by a middle-aged man with spectacles and rumpled clothes who identified himself as Dr. Wilson. I'm here to see Jackson Quinn, Victoria said without preamble. I'm his, she hesitated, unsure how to identify herself. I work at his ranch. The doctor studied her for a moment, taking in her travel-worn appearance and the worry etched on her face. It's mighty late for a social call, miss. Please, Victoria said, her voice breaking slightly. I need to see him. Something in her expression must have convinced him, for he stepped aside. He's upstairs, first door on the right. Just had a dose of laudanum, so he might not be entirely coherent. Victoria thanked him and hurried up the stairs, her heart pounding. At the door, she paused, taking a deep breath before entering. The room was small but clean, lit by a single lamp turned low. Jackson lay on a narrow bed, his upper body bandaged, his face pale against the white pillowcase. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow but steady. Victoria approached quietly, settling into a chair beside the bed. Up close, she could see the sheen of sweat on his brow, the lines of pain around his mouth even in sleep. "Oh, Jackson," she whispered, reaching out to take his hand. It was warm, too warm, suggesting fever but solid and real in her grasp. At her touch, Jackson's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then settling on her face. Confusion gave way to recognition, then wonder. "Victoria," he murmured, his voice rough. "Are you really here, or is this the laudanum talking?" A small laugh escaped her, though it sounded perilously close to a sob. "I'm really here. Vernon brought me as soon as we heard you were injured." Jackson's hand tightened weakly around hers. "Shouldn't have come, not safe, the rustlers." "They've been caught," Victoria assured him, having gotten the details from Vernon during their journey. "The deputy has them in custody. It's over." Relief flickered across Jackson's face, followed by a grimace of pain as he tried to shift position. Victoria quickly reached for the glass of water on the bedside table, helping him take a small sip. "The doctor says you'll recover," she told him, smoothing back a lock of hair that had fallen across his forehead. "But you'll need to rest and let yourself heal properly." Jackson's eyes, though clouded with pain and medication, held hers intently. "You came all this way in the middle of the night." "Of course I did," Victoria said simply. "You promised we would talk when you returned. Since you couldn't come to me, I came to you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Stubborn woman. You have no idea," she replied, returning his smile through the tears that threatened to spill. Jackson's eyes began to drift closed again, the laudanum pulling him back toward sleep. "Stay," he murmured, his fingers still entwined with hers. "Please?" "I'm not going anywhere," Victoria promised, settling more comfortably in the chair and preparing for a long night's vigil. True to her word, Victoria remained at Jackson's side throughout the night and into the next day. Dr. Wilson, after initial reluctance, seemed to accept her presence, even enlisting her help when it came time to change Jackson's bandages. The wound was ugly, a ragged hole just below his left collarbone where the bullet had entered, and a larger exit wound at the back of his shoulder. The doctor had cleaned and stitched both wounds, but infection remained a concern. "He's lucky," Dr. Wilson told Victoria as they worked. "An inch lower and the bullet would have hit his lung or heart." Victoria's hands trembled at the thought, but she forced herself to remain calm and focused on the task of helping tend to Jackson. For 3 days, she barely left his side, sleeping in the chair beside his bed and eating only when the doctor's wife brought food. Jackson drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes clear-headed enough to converse, other times delirious with fever, calling out in his sleep. It was during one of these feverish episodes that Victoria learned more about Jackson's past than he had ever willingly shared. He spoke of his parents and sister, of watching them die one by one from cholera, of being sent to live with his Uncle James whom he'd never met before. "So alone," he murmured, his head tossing on the pillow. "Always alone." "Not anymore," Victoria whispered, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth. "I'm here, Jackson, you're not alone anymore." Whether he heard her or not, he seemed to calm at the sound of her voice, his restless movements subsiding. On the fourth day, Jackson's fever broke. Victoria, dozing in her chair after a long night, woke to find him watching her, his eyes clear and alert for the first time since she'd arrived. "Good morning," she said, straightening in her chair and smoothing her rumpled dress. She was acutely aware of her disheveled appearance after days without proper rest or toilette. "How long have you been here?" Jackson asked, his voice stronger than it had been, though still weak. "Since the night we got word you were injured," Victoria admitted. "About 4 days now." Jackson's eyes widened slightly. "You've been sitting in that chair for 4 days, more or less," Victoria said with a small smile. "Though Dr. Wilson's wife did insist I use their bathing room yesterday, for which I was extremely grateful." Jackson studied her face, taking in the dark circles under her eyes and the weariness in her posture. "You look exhausted." "Such flattery," Victoria teased. "I can see you're feeling better." A smile tugged at his lips. "Better enough to notice you need rest in a real bed." Before Victoria could protest, the door opened and Dr. Wilson entered, looking pleased to find his patient awake and coherent. "Good morning, Mr. Quinn. Fever's broken, I see. That's excellent news." After examining Jackson's wound and pronouncing it healing nicely, the doctor turned to Victoria. "Miss Calloway, now that our patient is out of danger, I must insist you get some proper rest. Mrs. Wilson has prepared the spare room for you." Victoria hesitated, reluctant to leave Jackson's side even now. Jackson, however, nodded in agreement with the doctor. "Go," he told her gently. "I'll still be here when you wake up." Too exhausted to argue further, Victoria allowed herself to be led to the small but comfortable guest room, where she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep almost as soon as her head touched the pillow. She woke hours later to early evening light filtering through the curtains. After washing her face and tidying her hair as best she could, she returned to Jackson's room to find him sitting up in bed, propped against several pillows, a bowl of broth on the table beside him. "You look better," he observed as she entered. "As do you," Victoria replied, taking her usual chair. "Dr. Wilson says your wound is healing well." Jackson nodded, his expression turning serious. "Victoria, there's something we need to discuss." Her heart skipped a beat. "Yes, you can't stay here," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "It's not proper you spending days and nights at my bedside. People will talk." Victoria felt a flicker of hurt, though she understood his concern. "I don't care what people think." "Maybe not now," Jackson said, "but someday you might." "Your reputation, my reputation," Victoria interrupted, "is hardly my primary concern when you've been shot and might have died." Jackson's expression softened. "I appreciate that, more than I can say, but the danger's past now, and I need to know you're safe and your good name is protected." "What are you suggesting?" Victoria asked, a knot forming in her stomach. "That I return to the ranch without you." "No," Jackson said quickly. "I'm suggesting we get married." Victoria stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What did you say?" "Married," Jackson repeated, a flush creeping up his neck that had nothing to do with fever. "It's the only solution that makes sense. You've been at my bedside for days. Half the town knows it by now. The only way to protect your reputation is to make you my wife." Victoria stood abruptly, moving to the window to hide the conflicting emotions on her face. "That's hardly a romantic proposal, Mr. Quinn." Behind her, she heard Jackson sigh. "I'm making a mess of this, aren't I?" Victoria turned back to face him, arms crossed protectively over her chest. "You're suggesting marriage as a solution to a problem of propriety. Forgive me if I'm not swept off my feet." Jackson struggled to sit up straighter, wincing at the movement. "That's not Victoria, please come here." Reluctantly, she returned to his bedside. Jackson reached for her hand, which she gave him after a moment's hesitation. "Before I left to track those rustlers," he said, his blue eyes intent on hers. "I told you that I saw you in the future of Pine Creek Ranch. That wasn't just talk, Victoria. I've known for weeks, months, maybe that I wanted to ask you to be my wife, not my housekeeper, not my employee, my partner, my wife." Victoria's heart began to race. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "I was afraid," Jackson admitted, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand. "Afraid you'd say no. Afraid you'd eventually want to return east to civilization. Afraid of letting someone get close again after losing everyone I ever loved." The vulnerability in his confession moved her deeply. "And now, nearly dying has a way of clarifying things," Jackson said with a wry smile. "I love you, Victoria. I think I have since that first day when you stood in the station with your letter to the wrong address, looking so lost and determined all at once. I want to marry you because I can't imagine my life without you in it, not because of what anyone else might think." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy rather than sadness. "That," she said softly, "is a much better proposal. Is that a yes?" Jackson asked, hope evident in his voice. Instead of answering immediately, Victoria leaned down and pressed her lips to his in a gentle kiss. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. "Yes, I'll marry you, Jackson Quinn." His arm, the one not bound in bandages, came up to cradle the back of her head, keeping her close as he deepened the kiss. When they finally parted, both were breathless and smiling. "As soon as I'm well enough to stand," Jackson promised, "we'll make it official." 2 weeks later, on a clear September morning, Victoria Calloway became Victoria Quinn in a simple ceremony performed by the minister of Sweetwater's small church. Jackson, still weak but determined to stand on his own 2 feet for the occasion, wore his best shirt and a new black coat ordered specially from the general store. Victoria wore a dress of pale blue calico she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. The ceremony was attended by the ranch hands, Dr. and Mrs. Wilson, and a few townspeople who had come to know Victoria during her stay in Sweetwater. Mrs. Thornton, the mayor's wife, seemed particularly pleased, taking credit for having seen the match coming all along. "I told you she was perfect for him the moment I laid eyes on her," Victoria overheard her telling her husband. "A proper Eastern lady is just what Jackson Quinn needed to settle him down." Victoria hid her smile, knowing that neither she nor Jackson fit neatly into anyone else's expectations. She was no longer the proper Boston lady she had once been, and Jackson was far more complex than the rough rancher most people saw. After the ceremony and a small reception at the hotel, Jackson and Victoria returned to Pine Creek Ranch as husband and wife. Vernon and the other hands had prepared a surprise. The main house had been cleaned from top to bottom, the porch decorated with pine boughs and ribbons, and a sign reading "Welcome Home, Mr. and Mrs. Quinn" hung over the door. "They've been busy," Jackson remarked as he helped Victoria down from the wagon. "They respect you," Victoria said, "and they want us to be happy." Jackson's arm tightened around her waist. "I am happy. Happier than I ever thought possible." That night, after the celebrations had ended and they were finally alone, Jackson took Victoria's hand and led her upstairs to what had been his bedroom and was now theirs. The room had been transformed. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, new linens adorned the bed, and a vase of wildflowers sat on the dresser, all Victoria's touches added in the days before the wedding. "It looks like a proper home now," Jackson observed, standing in the doorway. Victoria turned to him, her heart full of love for this man who had given her not just a job and shelter when she needed it most, but a future, a purpose, a home. "It is a home," she said softly, "our home." Jackson pulled her into his arms, mindful of his still healing shoulder, and kissed her with a tenderness that belied his strength. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he murmured against her lips. "Someone who could see past the ranch and the roughness to who I really am. And I never thought I'd find myself in Wyoming, married to a cowboy," Victoria replied with a smile. "Life has a way of surprising us." "Best surprise of my life," Jackson said, "was finding you on my doorstep, even if you were sent to the wrong address." Victoria's laugh was cut short by his kiss, deep and passionate, full of promise for their future together. "I think," she whispered when they finally parted. It was exactly the right address after all. 5 years later, Victoria stood on the porch of Pine Creek Ranch, watching as Jackson led their 3-year-old daughter Sarah on her first pony ride around the corral. The little girl's delighted laughter carried on the summer breeze, along with Jackson's patient instructions. "Look, Mama." Sarah called out, spotting Victoria. "I'm riding like Papa, I see you, darling," Victoria called back, waving. "You're doing wonderfully." Beside her in a cradle, their 6-month-old son James slept peacefully, his tiny features a perfect blend of his parents. Victoria rocked the cradle gently with her foot as she continued to watch her husband and daughter. Pine Creek Ranch had flourished under their joint care. Jackson's cattle operation had expanded, and Victoria had started a small but successful business selling preserves and baked goods to the growing town of Sweetwater. The main house had been enlarged to accommodate their growing family, and Aliner's cabin had been converted into a guest house for the occasional visitors from back east. Life wasn't always easy. The Wyoming winters were still harsh, the work never ending, and the isolation sometimes difficult. But Victoria had never regretted her decision to stay, to build a life with Jackson in this wild, beautiful place. As if sensing her thoughts, Jackson looked up from the corral and caught her eye. Even after 5 years of marriage, that simple connection could still make her heart skip a beat. He smiled, the special smile he reserved only for her, full of love and promise and shared memories. Victoria smiled back, thinking of the letter that had brought her west to the wrong address and the man who had told her it was exactly right. Jackson had been right that day, as he often was about the important things in life. This was where she belonged. This was home.